Hi there, this is Dr. Saburi again. Today we will talk about transfer costs and its effect on markets. And in order to discuss that, we use farm households as example. So what are transfer costs? Those are costs that a household incurs when it undertakes a market transaction. And it includes transportation costs as well as transaction costs. So transportation costs include costs of carrying goods or workers between the farm and the market center. So keep in mind again, we are talking of the example of a farm household participating in markets for labor and also in markets for goods and services in this example. And transaction costs would include the costs of identifying buyer and sellers and also reaching agreements regarding transaction. So transaction costs help us explain why the prices at which items may be purchased are typically higher than the prices at which they may be sold in the same location. So the retailers who purchase the items from producers and then sell them to consumers, they must earn enough on their sales in order to cover for additional costs that they have for distributing the goods. So when we are talking here about costs, we are talking about economic costs, so opportunity costs, etc. That should be all included and it should be accordingly covered. Now our focus in this video is on transfer costs. So transfer costs might cause farm households to actually remain outside of markets, both if you think of labor markets, for example, or also markets for goods and services. One reason households might be autark is exactly because of transfer costs. Farm households might actually choose not to participate in a market, even for a crop that is important to them, if the cost of participating in the markets is higher than the benefits of participating in the market. So let's take a closer look into the graph to understand this better. Here on this graph, we have labor on the x-axis, so the quantity of labor, and all the prices are in the y-axis. In this example, prices happen to be in pesos, not in US dollars. And we see here two curves. On the one hand, we see here this downward sloping VMPL curve, which is value marginal product of labor. So it is essentially the marginal product of labor multiplied with the price of the product. The other curve that we see here is the HLS, and HLS stands for household labor supply. So that is the amount of money that a household needs to receive in order to sacrifice an additional day of their free time or home time. And the intersection between the two curves is showing us the equilibrium under autarkies. Now there are two lines that we see. W is assumed to be wage, so the price of labor. However, if you want to earn money on the labor market, so if you want to work for someone else, we have to subtract the TO, which represents the per day transfer cost of hiring out family labor to the labor market. So it has essentially to do with the transfer costs. You have to go to some other place, essentially commute to work, versus if you work in your own family farm, it's right there. You have to find the job, you have to deal with other people, and also the transaction costs are part of it as well, of course. So we would have to subtract it from W, the wage, to get essentially the after transfer costs wage to the household. On the other hand, if you want to hire a laborer, you have to also endure costs and that cost is represented by TI. So TI is the per day transfer cost of hiring in non-family labor from the labor market. So also for hiring labor, of course, you have to deal with transaction costs. You might have to actually transport the laborer to your farm and back home and all those things that come with it. So hiring labor is also more expensive than the wage that you pay. We have to add those transfer costs on top of it. So it costs me essentially W plus TI to hire labor. And if on the other hand I offer my labor force on the market, if I choose to work outside of my own home farm, the net wage that I get is W minus TO, and that gap between TI and TO is what will be interesting for us in the analysis. So in this example here, the autarky equilibrium is exactly between TO and TI, which means that for that family, they would choose to not participate in the labor market because the cost of hiring labor from the labor market is W plus TI, which is higher than the value marginal productivity of labor. So it's not worth it to hire labor from outside, but also it's not worth it to offer, in this case, your own labor force in the labor market. Why? Because the salary that you receive after the transfer costs, W minus TO, is lower than your household labor supply at the autarky equilibrium. So you do not get enough compensated for working outside of your own farm, which means in this particular situation, the household chooses to produce their crops themselves without using labor from outside, but they also don't have additional labor to offer on the labor market. Let's take a look at another scenario, and for that scenario, let's focus here on the left graph. In this case, the autarky equilibrium here is again the intersection between the household labor supply curve and the value marginal productivity of labor curve, and that is below both the W plus TI, which is the cost to the household of employing labor in the labor market, and it is below the W minus T0, which is the net salary that you take home net of the transfer cost. So in this case, the situation is different in the sense that the household can improve its utility relative to its autarky utility by selling some of its labor. Let's take a look here at the autarky labor quantity. The benefit to the household of hiring out labor is greater than the cost of the household of working another hour in their own farm. Now the next question is, how many hours of labor would the household actually choose to work in the labor market outside of their own family farm? It is helpful if you pause the video briefly and take a look and try to figure out the answer. Let's take a look. To figure out the answer, we need to compare the value marginal productivity of labor with the wage that they would receive if they would offer the labor in the market, net of the transfer cost, so W minus T, in L days per year. The household gains more if they utilize their labor in their own farm, as the value marginal productivity of labor is higher than the wage they would receive at the labor market. Once we pass this intersection, it is not worth it anymore to work in your own farm. Why? Because the wage that you receive outside of the farm on the labor market, even net of the transfer costs, is higher than the value marginal productivity of labor in your own farm. So essentially you would work only L hours in your own farm, and the rest of it in the labor market. Now, working in the labor market is only attractive as long as the wage that you receive net of the transfer costs is higher than your reservation price for labor, which is represented by your household labor supply curve. So beyond this point, you choose not to work because it's not worth it to sacrifice another day of your time that you could have as spare time. You would not want to work more than this point, which means your labor supply is represented by this area, S minus L. That is the labor supply of the household that we are considering. Now let's take a look into the middle graph. In this middle graph, the situation is the opposite of the right graph. The autarky equilibrium of labor has a price, if you look on the y-axis in pesos, which is higher both than the price of offering your labor on the labor market and higher than the price that would cost you after the transfer cost to hire labor in your own farm, in which case then the family actually hires labor from the labor market. So the household works here as a employer. Now, how much will be their demand given this situation? Well, in this area, the household labor supply is not only below the value marginal productivity of labor, but it's also lower than the W plus TI, what is effectively going to be the cost for the family of hiring labor. So the first S units of labor, the family chooses to work themselves in the farm. However, beyond that point, they rather just hire someone to work for them. Why? Because the salary that they pay to the labor is lower than the reservation price of the household to work in the farm. So they are better off simply hiring labor than working in the farm beyond the point S. However, it doesn't end there. It is worth it for the household to hire more than the autarky equilibrium. Why? Because the value marginal productivity of labor is still higher than the W plus TI, which is the cost of the household, including the transfer costs of hiring labor from the labor market. So how many hours of labor does the household employ? Well, so it's gonna be that L minus the S. They wouldn't need more than L hours of labor because the value marginal productivity of labor is below the W plus TI. However, the first S days of labor per year, the household chooses to do it themselves because the reservation price for working, which is represented by the household labor supply curve, is below the W plus TI, which is the total cost for the household hiring labor from the labor market. And the right graph is the one that we discussed previously, which is the case where the household does not engage in the labor market at all because the equilibrium in autarky is above the W minus TO but below the W plus TI. So that is it for today. Thank you very much.